They served me cold soup while they sat around the table eating steaming hot lasagna, laughing like I wasn't even there. That was the moment I realized I had become invisible in my own home. 3 months later, when the temperature dropped to 15 degrees and their heat suddenly stopped working, they discovered just how cold reality could be when you push the wrong person too far. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Sullivan, and I'm 71 years old. For the past 2 years, I had been living in what used to be my family home in Millbrook, Wisconsin, a small town where everyone knows your business before you do. The house was a sprawling colonial that my late husband Robert and I had bought in 1978, back when the mortgage seemed impossibly large, but the future felt infinite. We raised 3 children in that house: David, Sarah, and Michael. We hosted Christmas mornings, birthday parties, and countless Sunday dinners, where the dining room table groaned under the weight of homemade meals and genuine laughter. Robert passed away 4 years ago after a brief but brutal battle with pancreatic cancer. The grief had hit me like a physical blow, leaving me struggling to navigate not just the emotional devastation, but the practical realities of maintaining a large house on a fixed income. That's when David, my eldest, suggested I move in with his family. "It makes perfect sense, Mom," he had said, his voice carrying that tone of patient reasonableness that had always made him sound older than his 45 years. "We have plenty of space, and you shouldn't be rattling around in that big house all alone." At first, it seemed like a blessing. David lived with his wife Jennifer and their 2 teenage children, Emma and Tyler, in a modern 2-story house on Maple Street. It was newer than my colonial, all clean lines and open concepts, with a kitchen island that could seat 6 and a family room with a fireplace that never seemed to get used. Jennifer worked as a marketing coordinator for a local insurance company, and David managed a hardware store downtown. They were busy, successful, the kind of family that looked perfect in Christmas card photos. The arrangement started simply enough. I would contribute $800 monthly toward household expenses, help with cooking and cleaning, and provide built-in babysitting when needed. In exchange, I would have my own bedroom and bathroom on the first floor, access to all common areas, and the comfort of family nearby. It sounded reasonable, even generous. But somewhere between moving in and that cold February evening when everything changed, I had become something less than family, and more than a boarder. I had become a convenience. I hamahedi lakatai. It began with small things, the kind of slights that are easy to dismiss as oversights or misunderstandings. Jennifer would make dinner plans without asking if I had eaten. David would adjust the thermostat without considering that I felt the cold more acutely than the rest of them. The teenagers would monopolize the television during the hours I usually watched my evening programs, and when I gently mentioned it, I was told I could always watch in my room. The seating arrangements at meals shifted gradually. Initially, I sat at the head of the table where Robert and I used to sit together during family visits. Then I was moved to the side, then to the chair closest to the kitchen so I could help serve more easily. Eventually, I found myself eating many meals standing at the kitchen counter while they gathered around the dining table, discussing their days, their plans, their lives, that somehow no longer included me in any meaningful way. The cold soup incident happened on a Tuesday evening in February. Jennifer had made lasagna, a beautiful multi-layered creation with bubbling cheese and the rich aroma of garlic and oregano that filled the entire house. She had also made a salad with fresh greens and homemade vinaigrette, and there was crusty bread warming in the oven. The family gathered around the dining table as usual, steam rising from their plates, their faces flushed with warmth and satisfaction. I had been in my room reading when the dinner smells reached me. I waited for someone to call me, as had been the routine in earlier months. When no call came, I ventured into the kitchen, expecting to find my plate waiting or perhaps to be invited to join them. Instead, Jennifer looked up from cutting Tyler's lasagna and said, "Oh, Margaret, there's some soup in the refrigerator from yesterday. You can heat it up if you want." The soup she referred to was a thin chicken broth with a few sad vegetables floating in it, left over from a meal I had prepared 2 days earlier when I was feeling under the weather. It had been sitting in a plastic container in the back of the refrigerator, congealing and developing that peculiar film that soup gets when it's been forgotten. "There's plenty of lasagna," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "It smells wonderful." Jennifer glanced at David, a quick look that passed between them like a shared secret. "Well, we made just enough for the four of us," she said. "I didn't realize you'd want any. You usually eat earlier." This was not true. I had never established a pattern of eating earlier. If anything, I had always tried to time my hunger to coincide with family meals, hoping to maintain some sense of belonging, some rhythm of togetherness that might bridge the growing distance I felt in the house. "I could make more," I offered, already knowing the response. "Don't be silly," David said without looking up from his plate. "That soup is perfectly good. Waste not, want not, right?" So I stood at the kitchen counter, ladling cold soup into a bowl, while 20 feet away my family ate hot, fresh food, and talked about Emma's upcoming field trip and Tyler's basketball game. The soup was thin and tasteless, more like water than nourishment. Each spoonful felt like swallowing my own diminishing worth. Sigh. I didn't say anything that night. I didn't protest or argue or demand equal treatment. I simply ate my cold soup in silence while they discussed their warm, full lives. But something crystallized in that moment. Something that had been building for months of small cruelties and casual dismissals. I realized that I had allowed myself to become a ghost in a house where I was paying to live, contributing to maintain, and helping to run. Later that evening, after the dishes were done and the family had scattered to their respective activities, I sat in my room and thought about the thermostat. David controlled it completely, keeping the house at a steady 68 degrees during the day and dropping it to 65 at night to save money. I had asked several times if we could raise it just a degree or two, explaining that my circulation wasn't what it used to be and that I often felt chilled. Each time, I was told that 65 was perfectly comfortable and that I could always wear more layers. But there I was, wearing a sweater and thick socks in my own living space, while they moved freely in t-shirts and light clothing, comfortable in their warm environment while I adapted to their preferences. Just like the soup, just like the seating arrangements, just like everything else in a house where I had somehow become a second-class resident. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I realized that if they wanted to treat me like I didn't matter, like my comfort and dignity were secondary to their convenience, then perhaps it was time they experienced what it felt like to be cold and unwelcome in their own space. The house had an old heating system, a gas furnace that Robert had helped David understand during one of our Christmas visits years earlier. David prided himself on being handy, but his knowledge was surface level at best. He knew how to adjust the thermostat and maybe change a filter, but the deeper workings of the system were a mystery to him. What David didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Robert had taught me everything about that house's mechanical systems during our 40-year marriage. I knew where every shut-off valve was located, how to read the electrical panel, and exactly which circuit controlled what. Robert had been old-fashioned in many ways, but he believed that knowledge was power, and that I should never be helpless in my own home. As I sat in my room that cold February night, eating my cold soup and wearing my sweater in a house I was paying to live in, I began to formulate a plan that would teach my family the difference between being uncomfortable and being disrespected. The next morning dawned clear and bitter cold, with temperatures that the local weatherman cheerfully announced would drop into the teens by evening. It was going to be a perfect day for a lesson in empathy, though my family didn't know it yet. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I wasn't always the kind of person who planned revenge while eating cold soup in someone else's kitchen. For most of my 71 years, I had been what people in Millbrook called a good woman, the type who brought casseroles to new neighbors, organized church bake sales, and never spoke an unkind word about anyone, even when they deserved it. My maiden name was Margaret O'Brien, and I grew up in a household where respect wasn't just expected, it was demonstrated daily. My father, Patrick O'Brien, worked at the paper mill for 37 years, coming home each evening with ink-stained hands and stories about his co-workers that made my mother laugh while she served dinner. My mother, Catherine, managed our household of 5 children with the efficiency of a general and the warmth of a saint. We weren't wealthy. Mill workers' families rarely were, but we were never made to feel less than anyone else. The most important lesson my parents taught me was about dignity. "Margaret, my mother would say while braiding my hair before school. You treat others the way you want to be treated, but you never let anyone treat you like you're worth less than you are. It was a simple philosophy, but it had guided me through 43 years of marriage, 35 years of teaching high school English, and the complex navigation of raising 3 children who each tested that philosophy in their own ways. I met Robert Sullivan at a church dance in 1972. He was 25, working as an apprentice electrician, with calloused hands and a shy smile that made my heart skip in a way that surprised me. I was 23, teaching at Millbrook High School, and had already decided that I was probably destined to be an old maid. The other young men in town seemed intimidated by the fact that I had a college degree and opinions about books they'd never read. But Robert was different. He didn't try to diminish my intelligence or make jokes about school marms. Instead, he asked me about the books I was teaching, listened to my frustrations about students who couldn't see the beauty in Shakespeare, and gradually began sharing his own dreams about starting his own electrical contracting business. When he proposed 2 years later, he did it while I was grading papers at my kitchen table, simply sliding a ring box between my red pen and a stack of essays about Romeo and Juliet. "I know you're smart enough to do better than me," he said, his voice nervous but steady. "But I'm hoping you're also smart enough to see that I'll spend my whole life trying to deserve you." We built our life together with the same methodical care Robert brought to wiring houses. We saved money, bought the Colonial on Elm Street, and created a home that became the gathering place for our extended families. I continued teaching while Robert grew his business from a one-man operation to a company that employed 12 people. We had David in 1978, Sarah in 1981, and Michael in 1984. Each child was planned, wanted, and welcomed into a house where dinner was served at 6 o'clock sharp, and everyone's day mattered equally. I was the kind of mother who attended every school play, packed elaborate lunches with handwritten notes, and stayed up late helping with science projects that inevitably became more complicated than anyone anticipated. But I was also the mother who expected respect, kindness, and basic human decency from my children. They had chores, curfews, and consequences when they failed to meet expectations. Love wasn't conditional in our house, but comfort certainly was. David, my eldest, was serious and responsible from an early age. He liked rules, structure, and clear expectations. He was the child who never needed to be reminded to do his homework, and who genuinely enjoyed helping Robert with electrical projects in the garage. He graduated valedictorian from Millbrook High, attended the University of Wisconsin on a partial scholarship, and returned home with a business degree and a plan to eventually take over Robert's company. Sarah was our creative spirit, the child who painted murals on her bedroom walls, and convinced us to let her turn the basement into a theater where she staged elaborate productions with neighborhood children. She was also the most empathetic of our children, the one who brought home stray cats and befriended the kids other children ignored. She became a social worker, moved to Portland, Oregon, and called every Sunday to check on us until the day Robert died. Michael was our surprise, our change-of-life baby, who arrived when I was 40 and Robert was 42. He was the most like me, bookish, stubborn, and prone to asking questions that made adults uncomfortable. He excelled in school but struggled socially, preferring the company of adults to his peers. He earned a scholarship to Northwestern University, studied journalism, and now worked as a freelance writer in Chicago, covering political campaigns and social justice issues. All 3 children had been raised with the same values: treat people with kindness, work hard for what you want, and never forget where you came from. They had seen Robert and me navigate financial struggles, family illness, and the ordinary challenges of maintaining a marriage and raising children without losing sight of what mattered most: respect for each other and the understanding that family meant showing up, especially when it was inconvenient. When Robert was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, our children rallied in ways that made me proud. David took over the daily operations of the electrical business so Robert could focus on treatment. Sarah flew home every few weeks, organizing meal trains and coordinating with doctors. Michael temporarily relocated from Chicago, sleeping on our couch and driving Robert to chemotherapy appointments while researching experimental treatments and alternative therapies. But after Robert died, something shifted in the family dynamic. Sarah, devastated by the loss, threw herself into her work and began calling less frequently. Michael, perhaps unable to cope with the house full of memories, returned to Chicago and resumed his peripatetic lifestyle. David, suddenly responsible for both his family and his grieving mother, began making decisions based on practicality rather than sentiment. When David suggested I move in with his family, it seemed like the natural solution to several problems. I would have companionship and assistance as I aged, they would have built-in childcare and household help, and we would maintain the close family bonds that had always been our strength. What I hadn't anticipated was how different it would feel to be a dependent rather than a matriarch, a guest rather than a host. Jennifer, David's wife of 15 years, was a pleasant woman who had always been cordial during family gatherings, but had never been particularly warm. She was efficient, organized, and focused on maintaining the kind of household that looked perfect from the outside. She decorated for every season, hosted elaborate birthday parties for Emma and Tyler, and kept a social calendar that seemed designed to impress their neighbors and colleagues. But Jennifer also had very specific ideas about how things should be done, and those ideas didn't include input from a mother-in-law who might have different preferences or expectations. Within weeks of my arrival, it became clear that I was expected to adapt to their routines, rather than contribute to creating new ones that worked for everyone. Emma, at 17, was a typical teenager, absorbed in her own drama, mildly resentful of any adult attention, and completely oblivious to the needs of anyone over the age of 25. She wasn't deliberately cruel, just utterly self-centered, in the way that adolescents often are. Tyler, at 15, was more openly dismissive, treating me like an inconvenient piece of furniture that took up space and occasionally made noise. The transition from being Margaret Sullivan, respected teacher and beloved wife, to becoming grandma who lived in the spare room and could be counted on to babysit but not consulted on important decisions, was more jarring than I had expected. I found myself constantly adjusting to their schedule, their preferences, their way of doing things, without anyone asking how I might like things done or what would make me feel more comfortable. Teaching had been my identity for 35 years. I had been the kind of teacher students remembered, the one who pushed them to think critically and write with passion. I had served on curriculum committees, mentored new teachers, and retired with a reputation as someone who made a difference. But in David's house, my professional accomplishments seemed irrelevant. I was just an elderly woman who needed looking after, not an intelligent adult with decades of experience and wisdom to contribute. The cold soup incident wasn't an isolated event. It was the culmination of months of small indignities that had slowly eroded my sense of worth and belonging. Each time I accepted a lesser meal, a less comfortable chair, a lower temperature setting, I was teaching them that my comfort and dignity were negotiable. I was enabling them to see me as less than equal, and they had learned that lesson thoroughly. That realization, sitting in my room on that cold February night, wasn't accompanied by anger or hurt. Instead, it brought a strange sense of clarity. I had spent 2 years trying to fit into their lives, accepting their rules, and accommodating their preferences. It was time to remind them that I wasn't just a convenient grandmother. I was Margaret Sullivan, and I had forgotten how to demand the respect I deserved. The next morning, I woke up with a plan forming in my mind. It wasn't born from spite or vengeance, but from a teaching instinct that had been dormant for too long. Sometimes the most powerful lessons aren't taught with words, they're taught through experience. And my family was about to get an education in empathy that they would never forget. The morning after the cold soup incident, I woke before dawn with a familiar ache in my joints that signaled another bitter Wisconsin winter day. Through my bedroom window, I could see frost covering the bare branches of the oak tree that Robert and I had planted in our backyard 30 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. Even that tree, now thriving in someone else's yard, seemed more rooted and valued than I felt in this house. I dressed quietly in layers: thermal underwear, wool pants, a heavy sweater, and thick socks. The morning routine that had once been about comfort had become about survival. David kept the house at 63 degrees overnight, claiming it was, quote, economical, but I suspected it was more about control than conservation. Jennifer could afford to keep the temperature low. She slept under a heated blanket, something she'd mentioned casually while I shivered through my first week in their home. In the kitchen, I found evidence of the family's evening snack ritual scattered across the counter. crumbs from expensive crackers, an empty container of imported cheese, and wine glasses that hadn't been rinsed. These late-night indulgences happened after I had retreated to my room, another small exclusion that reminded me I was living parallel to their lives rather than within them. I made my morning coffee quietly, using the instant variety I bought with my own money, since Jennifer had made it clear that the good coffee was reserved for the automatic espresso machine that only she and David knew how to operate. As I stirred the bitter liquid, I noticed the grocery list Jennifer kept on the refrigerator. My name appeared next to budget items: generic cereal, store-brand bread, discount soup cans. Their names were paired with organic produce, premium meats, and specialty items I couldn't pronounce. Even our food had been segregated. The breaking point began that Wednesday morning when Tyler stumbled into the kitchen, still wearing his basketball practice clothes from the night before. He moved past me without acknowledgement, opened the refrigerator, and began pulling out ingredients for what appeared to be an elaborate breakfast sandwich: thick-cut bacon, farm-fresh eggs, artisan bread, and aged cheddar cheese. "Good morning, Tyler," I said, hoping to bridge the growing distance with simple courtesy. He grunted something that might have been a response while turning on the stove and laying strips of bacon in a pan. The sizzling filled the kitchen with a rich aroma that made my stomach clench with hunger. I had eaten a piece of toast for breakfast, dry because the butter was apparently being saved for family meals. "That smells wonderful," I commented, genuinely trying to connect with my grandson. "Your grandfather used to make Saturday morning breakfasts just like that." Tyler looked at me with the barely concealed irritation that teenagers perfect sometime around their 15th birthday. "Yeah, well, this isn't Saturday, and I'm going to be late for school if I don't hurry." His tone carried an edge that went beyond typical adolescent surliness. It was dismissive, almost contemptuous, as if my presence in the kitchen was an inconvenience he shouldn't have to endure. I realized that Tyler had learned to speak to me the way he heard his parents speak to me, with casual disregard disguised as patience. "Of course," I said quietly, stepping back toward the counter where my coffee was growing cold. I didn't mean to interrupt, but Tyler wasn't finished. As he cracked eggs into the pan, he said without looking at me, "Mom says you used to be a teacher or something. Is that why you're always trying to start conversations when people are busy?" The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were particularly cruel, but because they revealed how thoroughly I had been diminished in this household. My 35 years of shaping young minds had been reduced to teacher or something, and my attempts at basic human connection were seen as annoying interruptions. I stood there, holding my lukewarm coffee, watching this boy who carried my late husband's eyes treat me like an unwelcome stranger. Tyler assembled his breakfast with the casual confidence of someone who had never questioned whether he deserved good food, warmth, or respect. The contrast between his elaborate meal and my dry toast felt like a metaphor for everything wrong with my current situation. Jennifer appeared in the kitchen moments later, moving with the brisk efficiency of someone managing a busy household. She was dressed for work in a sharp blazer and matching pants, her hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. She kissed Tyler's cheek and poured herself coffee from the espresso machine, the rich aroma filling the space between us like a barrier. "Morning, Margaret," she said without making eye contact, her voice carrying that tone of polite dismissal I had come to recognize. "I left a list of things that need doing today on the counter. Nothing too strenuous." I looked at the list, written in Jennifer's precise handwriting. "Vacuum downstairs, dust living room, start laundry, defrost something for dinner." Tasks that positioned me as household help, rather than family member. Tasks that assumed I had nothing else to do with my time, no interests or obligations of my own. "I was planning to visit the library today," I said carefully. "I wanted to research some volunteer opportunities." Jennifer's pause was barely perceptible, but I caught it. The slight tightening around her eyes, the way her coffee cup hesitated halfway to her lips. "Well, these things really need to get done," she said finally. "Maybe you could go to the library tomorrow." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an instruction delivered with the kind of false sweetness that made refusal seem unreasonable. I was being managed, scheduled, assigned tasks like an employee rather than consulted like a family member. "Of course," I heard myself say, hating the automatic compliance in my voice. "The library can wait." Tyler finished his breakfast and left his dishes on the counter, walking past me as if I were invisible. Jennifer gathered her things, checking her phone and muttering about meetings and deadlines. David appeared briefly, grabbed a travel mug of the good coffee, and kissed Jennifer goodbye. None of them said goodbye to me. And then I was alone in the kitchen, surrounded by their dishes and their mess, holding a list of chores that would fill my day with servitude. I stood there for a long moment, feeling something crystallize inside me that had been building for months. This was my breaking point. Not the cold soup, not the segregated food, not even Tyler's casual cruelty. It was the realization that I had become a non-person in this house, someone whose time, comfort, and dignity were completely expendable. I was paying $800 a month to be treated like unpaid help, and I had been accepting it because I was afraid of being alone. But standing in that kitchen, looking at Jennifer's list of tasks, I realized that I was already alone. I was isolated, diminished, and disrespected in a house where I was supposed to be family. The only difference between living here and living independently was that here, my loneliness came with daily humiliation. I walked to my room and sat on the bed that had become my entire living space. On the nightstand was a framed photo of Robert and me at our 40th wedding anniversary celebration. We were laughing at something one of our grandchildren had said, our faces bright with genuine joy and mutual affection. Robert's hand rested on my shoulder with casual intimacy, the touch of someone who valued and cherished the person beside him. That woman in the photograph, confident, beloved, respected, felt like a stranger to me now. I had allowed myself to become a shadow of who I used to be, accepting scraps of affection and basic necessities, as if I should be grateful for any consideration at all. I opened the dresser drawer where I kept my important papers and pulled out the folder containing my financial information. Social Security, pension from the school district, and a small but steady income from Robert's life insurance policy. I had more than enough money to live independently. I had been staying here not because I needed to, but because I had been afraid to. But sitting there, looking at the numbers that represented my independence, I realized I was more afraid of continuing to disappear than I was of living alone. I was tired of eating cold soup while others enjoyed hot meals. I was tired of being cold while others controlled the temperature. I was tired of being treated like a burden rather than a blessing. The plan that had been forming in my mind since the soup incident suddenly became crystal clear. I wasn't going to argue with them or plead for better treatment. I wasn't going to pack my bags and leave in dramatic fashion. Instead, I was going to teach them a lesson about consequences, about what it felt like to be cold and uncomfortable and powerless. I was going to remind them that respect wasn't optional, and that the woman they had been taking for granted still remembered how to fight back. That afternoon, while I completed Jennifer's list of household tasks, I began my research. I knew this house's heating system better than David realized, thanks to Robert's patient teaching and my own mechanical aptitude. But I needed to understand the newer components, the digital controls, and safety features that had been installed since Robert's time. I also needed to understand my legal position. As a paying resident with a verbal lease agreement, what were my rights? What were my obligations? And most importantly, what were the consequences if the family tried to retaliate against me for asserting those rights? By evening, I had a plan that was both elegant and educational. They wanted to treat me like I didn't matter. They were about to learn what it felt like when someone who actually mattered decided to withdraw their cooperation. The temperature was dropping outside, and the weather forecast called for a brutal cold snap that would last through the weekend. Perfect timing for a lesson in empathy that my family would never forget. That Thursday morning, I woke up as a different person than I had been the day before. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, more like the way dawn breaks in winter, gradually revealing a landscape that had been there all along but hidden in darkness. I lay in bed for a few extra minutes, listening to the familiar sounds of the house waking up. Jennifer's hairdryer humming in the master bathroom, David's heavy footsteps on the stairs, the gurgle of the coffee machine that I wasn't allowed to use. But instead of feeling excluded by these sounds, I felt detached from them. They belonged to people who had chosen to make me irrelevant to their lives. Why should I continue pretending that their comfort was more important than my dignity? I dressed deliberately that morning, choosing my navy wool slacks and the cream-colored sweater that Robert had always said brought out my eyes. I styled my hair the way I used to for parent-teacher conferences. Neat but not severe, professional but approachable. I wanted to look like the woman I had been before I started shrinking myself to fit into other people's expectations. In the bathroom mirror, I studied my reflection with new eyes. At 71, I was still sharp, still capable, still attractive in the way that confident women of any age possess. My posture had begun to curve inward over the past months, a physical manifestation of trying to take up less space, be less noticeable, cause fewer problems. I straightened my shoulders and lifted my chin, reclaiming the bearing that had commanded respect in countless classrooms. The kitchen was empty when I arrived, evidence of the family's hurried breakfast departure scattered across the counters. Tyler's plate sat unwashed in the sink, still bearing traces of syrup from the waffles he'd made using the Belgian waffle iron that Jennifer had declared too complicated for me to operate. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so insulting. I had been teaching teenagers to navigate complex literature for 3 decades, but apparently, I couldn't be trusted with kitchen appliances. I made my coffee, the instant variety that had become my compromise with their hierarchy, and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop. The computer was old, a gift from Michael several Christmases ago that I had barely used since Robert's death. But that morning, I opened it with purpose. First, I researched rental properties in Millbrook. I wasn't planning to move immediately, but I wanted to understand my options. What I found surprised me. There were several affordable apartments designed for seniors, complete with community centers and transportation services. I could afford something nicer than what I was currently enduring, with heat I could control and meals I could choose. The revelation was both liberating and infuriating. I had been accepting substandard treatment, not because I had no alternative, but because I had been afraid to explore alternatives. Fear had made me smaller, and smaller had made me invisible. Next, I researched Wisconsin tenant rights. Even without a formal lease, as a paying resident, I had certain protections under state law. I couldn't be evicted without proper notice. I had the right to quiet enjoyment of the premises. Most importantly, as someone contributing to household expenses, I had standing to dispute decisions that affected my living conditions, including temperature control. But beyond the legal research, I found myself drawn to articles about psychological dynamics in multi-generational households. I read about power structures, about how caregiving relationships could become unbalanced, about the ways elderly family members could be gradually marginalized without anyone recognizing the process. One article in particular resonated with me. It described how well-meaning families could unconsciously replicate patterns of institutional care in their homes, treating elderly relatives as patients rather than people. The author, a geriatric psychologist, wrote, "Dignity isn't preserved through kindness alone. It requires recognition of agency, autonomy, and the fundamental right to participate in decisions that affect one's daily life." I had lost my agency gradually, one small concession at a time. I had agreed to eat separately just this once, when they had unexpected guests. I had accepted the lower thermostat setting temporarily during a high utility bill month. I had moved from the dining room to the kitchen counter so I could be helpful during busy evenings. Each compromise had seemed reasonable in isolation, but together they had created a pattern of relegation that was anything but reasonable. The most powerful insight came from an article about institutional psychology written by a former nursing home administrator. She described how residents often lost their sense of self not through deliberate mistreatment, but through the gradual erosion of choice and control. When someone else decides what you eat, when you eat it, where you sit, and what temperature you're comfortable at, she wrote, you begin to forget that you ever had the right to make those decisions for yourself. That sentence hit me with the force of recognition. I had been institutionalized in my own family's home, trained to accept whatever accommodations they deemed appropriate without questioning whether those accommodations met my actual needs. But I was not a nursing home resident. I was not a charity case. I was Margaret Sullivan, a woman who had managed a household, raised 3 children, and commanded the respect of hundreds of students and parents over 3 decades. I had forgotten my own strength, but strength, once remembered, could be reclaimed. I spent the afternoon planning with the methodical approach I had once brought to curriculum design. Robert had always admired my ability to think systematically, to anticipate problems and develop comprehensive solutions. You could run a corporation, he used to say, if you weren't too busy running the world. The heating system would be my classroom, and my family would be my students. But unlike my high school students, who had learned through discussion and encouragement, my family would learn through experience. They would discover what it felt like to be cold and powerless, to have their comfort subject to someone else's arbitrary decisions. I researched the house's heating system online, cross-referencing the model number I found on the furnace with technical manuals and troubleshooting guides. Modern gas furnaces had multiple safety systems and diagnostic features that made them more complex than the older models Robert had taught me about. But complexity wasn't the same as impossibility, especially for someone who had spent her career breaking down difficult concepts into manageable components. The beauty of my plan wasn't just in its effectiveness, but in its educational value. They would experience exactly what they had been putting me through: the discomfort of being cold, the frustration of having no control over their environment, and the helplessness of depending on someone else's goodwill for basic comfort. But more than that, they would learn that actions have consequences, that treating people poorly creates enemies where there should be allies, and that underestimating someone because of their age or apparent vulnerability is a costly mistake. As the afternoon progressed, I felt something returning to me that I hadn't realized I'd lost: a sense of my own power. For months I had been reacting to their decisions, adapting to their preferences, accepting their limitations on my life. But power wasn't something that could be taken away. It could only be given away. And I had been giving mine away, one small surrender at a time. That evening, as I prepared a simple dinner from my segregated groceries, I listened to the family's after-school routine with new ears. Emma complaining about her teachers, Tyler demanding rides to various activities, Jennifer coordinating schedules with military precision, David nodding along while scrolling through his phone. None of them asked about my day or included me in their conversations, but for the first time in months, their exclusion didn't sting. Instead, I felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who had solved a complex problem. They had taught me that I didn't matter to them. Tomorrow, I would begin teaching them that they had been taking for granted someone who mattered very much indeed. I went to bed that night with a sense of anticipation I hadn't felt since my teaching days. There's a particular excitement that comes with designing a lesson you know will be transformative, one that will shift your students' understanding in a fundamental way. Some lessons are about imparting information, but the best lessons are about revealing truth. My family was about to learn some very cold truths about respect, consequences, and the difference between being elderly and being powerless. The forecast called for temperatures in the teens over the weekend, perfect conditions for an education they would never forget. Friday morning arrived with the kind of bitter wind that made the windows rattle, and reminded everyone that Wisconsin winter was far from over. The weather forecast had been promising for my purposes: a severe cold front moving in that would drop temperatures to single digits by Sunday, with wind chills well below zero. Mother Nature, it seemed, was going to be my teaching assistant. I waited until the house emptied before beginning my reconnaissance. David left first, his pickup truck coughing to life in the driveway as he headed to the hardware store. Jennifer followed 20 minutes later, her sedan already warmed and defrosted, thanks to the remote starter she'd installed last winter. Emma and Tyler caught their respective rides to school, leaving behind the usual trail of forgotten homework and breakfast dishes. The silence that filled the house after their departure wasn't the lonely quiet I'd grown accustomed to. It was purposeful, expectant. I was no longer waiting for them to include me in their lives. I was preparing to remind them why excluding me had been a mistake. I started in the basement, where Robert had given me my first education in home maintenance 40 years earlier. "Knowledge is insurance," he used to say while showing me the electrical panel, the water shutoffs, and the furnace controls. "You never know when you might need to solve a problem yourself." The current furnace was a Carrier model, installed 3 years ago when the old one finally gave up during a January cold snap. David had handled the installation process, proudly explaining to anyone who would listen how the new system was more efficient and had digital controls that could be programmed for optimal comfort. What he hadn't mentioned was how those same digital controls could be manipulated by someone who understood their logic. I photographed the unit from multiple angles, noting the model and serial numbers, the location of various switches and connections. The main gas shutoff valve was clearly marked, as was the electrical disconnect switch. But I wasn't planning anything as crude as simply turning off the system. That would be too obvious, too easily traced back to sabotage. Instead, I needed to create a malfunction that would appear mechanical, something that would require professional diagnosis and repair. Back upstairs, I opened my laptop and began researching the specific model online. Technical manuals, troubleshooting guides, and user forums provided a wealth of information about common problems and their symptoms. I learned about pressure switches, flame sensors, and limit controls, components that could fail in ways that would shut down the system without causing immediate danger. The most promising avenue was the pressure switch, a safety device that ensured proper airflow through the heat exchanger. If it malfunctioned, the furnace would start its ignition sequence but shut down before actually producing heat, displaying an error code that would suggest a mechanical failure rather than tampering. But I needed more than theoretical knowledge. I needed to understand the physical layout of the system and identify the most vulnerable points. This required a more detailed inspection, one that would give me hands-on familiarity with every component. I returned to the basement with a flashlight and a small toolkit that Robert had assembled for me years ago. The furnace was housed in a utility room that also contained the water heater, laundry connections, and storage shelves lined with Jennifer's extensive collection of seasonal decorations. It was a space the family rarely entered, which would work to my advantage. The access panels were secured with simple latches designed for easy maintenance rather than security. Inside, I found a maze of wires, tubes, and sensors that would have intimidated me months ago. But my morning of research had given me context for what I was seeing. I could identify the pressure switch, trace the gas line, and locate the various safety sensors that monitored the system's operation. The pressure switch was connected to the heat exchanger by a thin plastic tube that carried air pressure readings to the control board. If that tube became blocked or disconnected, the switch would detect a problem and prevent the system from operating. The beauty of this approach was that it would create exactly the kind of intermittent failure that could take days to properly diagnose. But I needed to be more sophisticated than simply crimping a tube. The failure had to appear natural, the result of normal wear or environmental factors, rather than deliberate interference. I studied the installation, looking for points where a gradual failure might occur under normal circumstances. The answer came when I noticed how the pressure switch tube was routed near the condensate drain line. Over time, humidity and temperature changes could cause condensation to accumulate in low points of the tubing, creating blockages that would interfere with pressure readings. If I could create a partial obstruction that would worsen under certain conditions, the system would begin failing intermittently before shutting down completely. I spent another hour mapping the system's vulnerabilities, taking photographs and notes that I could reference later. I also researched the repair process, understanding how a technician would approach the problem and how long it might take to identify and fix the issue. Knowledge of the repair timeline would be crucial for controlling the duration of my family's discomfort. Back upstairs, I continued my preparation with research into emergency heating alternatives and their availability in Millbrook. I needed to understand what options my family would have when their primary system failed and how quickly they could implement temporary solutions. Space heaters would be their most likely immediate response, but I discovered that hardware stores typically sold out quickly during cold snaps as people sought emergency heating solutions. The few units David kept in stock at his store would disappear within hours of customers learning about heating problems elsewhere in town. Professional repair services would be another bottleneck. A quick survey of local HVAC companies revealed that emergency weekend service calls carried premium rates and extended wait times during severe weather. Even if David could get someone to respond quickly, the diagnostic process for intermittent pressure switch problems could take hours. I also researched the specific error codes the system would display, familiarizing myself with the language technicians would use when explaining the problem. This knowledge would allow me to follow their diagnosis and ensure my sabotage remained undetected. The afternoon was devoted to practical preparation. I visited 3 different stores, purchasing small items that could be used to create controlled blockages in the pressure switch tubing. A tiny piece of steel wool, some clear tape, and a few other innocuous materials that would leave no trace of deliberate tampering. At the pharmacy, I picked up hand warmers and extra batteries for the small space heater I kept in my room. Not because I planned to be comfortable during the cold spell, but because I needed to maintain my health while my family learned their lesson. I was seeking justice, not martyrdom. I also purchased additional warm clothing and thermal underwear, items I could have afforded months ago but had been reluctant to buy because it felt like admitting defeat. Now, buying warm clothes felt like preparing for battle. Meiza. That evening, I sat in my room finalizing my timeline. The weather forecast showed temperatures beginning to drop Saturday evening, reaching their lowest point Sunday night through Monday morning. If I implemented my plan Saturday afternoon, the system would begin experiencing problems just as the cold became severe enough to make the loss of heat genuinely uncomfortable. The timing would also ensure that any repair attempts would be delayed until Monday at the earliest, giving the family a full weekend to experience the kind of powerless discomfort I had been enduring for months. I reviewed my research one final time, checking and double-checking my understanding of the system and the repair process. I had learned that the most effective sabotage wasn't dramatic or obvious. It was subtle, appearing natural while creating maximum inconvenience. As I prepared for bed, I felt the same focused calm I used to experience the night before administering a particularly challenging exam. I had done my research, prepared my materials, and developed a comprehensive plan. Tomorrow my family's education would begin in earnest. They had spent months teaching me that my comfort didn't matter to them. By Sunday morning, they would understand exactly what that lesson felt like when the roles were reversed. Saturday arrived with deceptive calm. The morning sun cast long shadows across the frost-covered lawn, and the sky held that peculiar clarity that often precedes severe weather. Inside the house, the family moved through their weekend routines, with the comfortable oblivion of people who had never questioned their access to warmth, comfort, or basic respect. I had slept better Friday night than I had in months, the deep rest that comes from having a clear purpose and a well-developed plan. I woke at 6:30, dressed in layers that would serve me well in the coming hours, and made my way to the kitchen where I prepared what would be my last peaceful breakfast in this house for several days. David was already at the table, scrolling through his phone while eating cereal from a bowl that cost more than the entire set of dishes I had eaten from during my first year of marriage. He glanced up when I entered, offered a perfunctory morning, and returned to his screen. The casual dismissal that would have stung just days ago now felt like confirmation that I was making the right choice. "Cold front's supposed to hit tonight," I mentioned, stirring honey into my oatmeal. "Weather service is calling for single digits by tomorrow morning." David nodded without looking up. "Yeah, saw that. Good thing we have reliable heat, right?" He said this with the unconscious confidence of someone who had never been forced to wear a sweater indoors, never been told that his comfort was secondary to someone else's budget concerns. "Yes," I agreed, allowing myself a small smile. "Very reliable." Jennifer appeared in her Saturday uniform of yoga pants and an oversized sweatshirt, moving with the brisk efficiency she brought to every task. She poured coffee from the machine I wasn't allowed to use and began organizing the day's activities. Emma had a friend's birthday party at 2, Tyler needed to be at basketball practice by 11, and she had grocery shopping and errands that would keep her busy until evening. "Margaret, could you keep an eye on the casserole I'm making for tonight? It needs to come out at 3:30. She said this while checking her phone, not bothering to make eye contact. Another assumption that my time was available for her convenience. Another reminder that I was seen as household staff rather than family. "Of course," I replied, though I knew that by 3:30 the casserole would be the least of her concerns. The family scattered according to their Saturday schedules, leaving me alone with the house and my mission. I waited until David's truck had backed out of the driveway and Jennifer's car had disappeared around the corner before retrieving my small toolkit and heading to the basement. The utility room felt different that morning, charged with possibility rather than mundane function. I had spent days studying this space, memorizing every component and connection, but now I was moving from theory to practice. The pressure switch tube that would be my primary target hung innocuously near the heat exchanger, just as I had mapped it during my reconnaissance. I began with the most delicate part of the operation, creating a blockage that would appear natural while ensuring it would worsen over time. Using a pair of needle nose pliers, I carefully loosened the tube connection at the pressure switch, just enough to create a microscopic gap. Into this gap, I inserted a tiny piece of steel wool that would gradually expand as moisture from the heating system's normal condensation cycle reached it. The beauty of this approach was its subtlety. The initial blockage would be minimal, allowing the system to function normally for several hours. But as condensation accumulated and the steel wool expanded, the blockage would become progressively worse, creating the kind of intermittent failure that was notoriously difficult to diagnose. Next, I created a secondary failure point by introducing a small piece of clear tape into the condensate drain line. This would cause moisture to back up gradually, creating additional pressure anomalies that would confuse diagnostic equipment and extend the repair timeline. The work required steady hands and careful attention to detail, skills I had developed during years of delicate classroom demonstrations and science fair projects. Each modification had to appear like normal wear and aging rather than deliberate sabotage. When I finished, I spent several minutes testing the access panels and ensuring everything appeared exactly as it had before my intervention. I photographed the final setup with my phone, not as evidence, but as documentation of my craftsmanship. Robert would have been proud of the precision and thoughtfulness I brought to this project. Back upstairs, I began my own preparations for the cold siege ahead. I moved my space heater from the closet to a corner of my room where it would be most effective. I arranged extra blankets and thermal clothing within easy reach. I prepared a thermos of hot tea and filled several water bottles that I could use as warming devices. Most importantly, I moved my laptop, phone charger, and a supply of food to my room. If the family blamed me for the heating failure, which they almost certainly would, I wanted to be prepared for the possibility that they might try to restrict my access to common areas or shared resources. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was preparing to endure the same cold conditions I was imposing on them, but I was doing so by choice, with preparation, and with the satisfaction of knowing that justice was finally being served. The temperature began dropping around noon, just as the weather service had predicted. I watched from my window as the wind picked up, rattling the bare branches and sending dead leaves skittering across the frozen ground. By 1 o'clock, the sun had disappeared behind a wall of gray clouds that promised the severe weather to come. Jennifer returned from her errands laden with grocery bags and wearing the slightly frantic expression of someone racing against an approaching storm. She bustled through the house, checking window latches and adjusting the thermostat to 72 degrees, 2 degrees warmer than she had ever allowed me to set it. "Getting really cold out there," she announced to no one in particular while unpacking expensive cuts of meat and organic vegetables. "Good thing we stocked up on everything we need." Tyler returned from basketball practice, red-faced and energetic, tracking snow across the kitchen floor without bothering to remove his shoes. "Coach says it's going to be brutal tonight," he said, grabbing a banana from the fruit bowl that was perpetually off-limits to me. Like, dangerously cold. The casual way he said, dangerously cold, while standing in a warm kitchen, wearing clean clothes, and eating fresh fruit, crystallized everything that was wrong with this family's perspective. They understood cold as an abstract concept, something that happened to other people, or existed outside their controlled environment. By 3 o'clock, the house had taken on that peculiar quiet that comes with severe weather approaching. The family gathered in the living room, unconsciously clustering together as the wind began to howl around the corners of the house. David built a fire in the fireplace, a luxury they indulged in only during the most severe weather, when the ambiance was worth the expense. I excused myself to my room, ostensibly to read, but actually to monitor the heating system's performance through the vent near my bed. For now, warm air continued to flow steadily, but I knew that as the condensation cycle progressed and my modifications took effect, that would change. At 4:30, I heard the first sign that my plan was working, the furnace cycling on and off more frequently than normal. The blockage was beginning to interfere with the pressure readings, causing the system to struggle with maintaining consistent operation. By 5:15, as the family gathered around the dinner table for Jennifer's casserole, the heat was running almost continuously but producing noticeably less warm air. I could hear David commenting on it from my room. "Feels a little cool in here. Maybe I should bump up the thermostat." At 6 o'clock, as the outside temperature plummeted towards single digits, the heating system gave its first prolonged failure. The furnace attempted to ignite, ran for 30 seconds, then shut down with an error code flashing on the digital display. I heard David's footsteps on the basement stairs, followed by the sound of him checking the obvious things: circuit breakers, gas supply, air filters. After 20 minutes, he returned upstairs with the confident voice of someone who believed he had solved the problem. "Just needed to reset the system," he announced. "Must have been a glitch." But I knew better. The reset would provide temporary relief, maybe an hour or two of normal operation, before the progressive blockage caused another failure. And each subsequent failure would be worse than the last, until the system finally shut down completely. As night fell and the wind began to howl with genuine ferocity, I settled into my room with my warm blankets and hot tea. Outside, the temperature was dropping toward 0. Inside, the house was about to become as cold and unwelcoming as my family had made me feel for the past several months. The education I had promised them was about to begin in earnest. By 9 o'clock Saturday night, David had made 3 more trips to the basement, each time growing more frustrated and less confident. The heating system was following my carefully orchestrated timeline, failing for longer periods, requiring more complex resets, and producing less heat even when it was running. The temperature inside the house had dropped to 65 degrees, and the family was beginning to understand that this wasn't a simple glitch. I lay in my bed, wrapped in thermal blankets and listening to the escalating drama through my bedroom door. Jennifer's voice carried a sharp edge of anxiety as she directed the children to find extra sweaters. Tyler complained loudly about being cold, his usual teenage bravado replaced by genuine discomfort. Emma had retreated to her room with multiple blankets, emerging only to ask why the house felt like a freezer. The irony was delicious. For months, I had requested warmer temperatures and been told that 65 degrees was perfectly comfortable, and that I should put on a sweater if I felt cold. Now, with the thermostat reading the same temperature they had imposed on me, they were acting as if they were experiencing Arctic conditions. Around 10:30, I heard David on the phone with someone, his voice tight with frustration. "I know it's Saturday night, but this is an emergency. We have children in the house, and it's supposed to hit 0 tonight." He was calling emergency repair services, just as I had predicted, but my research had revealed what he was about to discover. Weekend emergency calls during severe weather came with premium pricing and limited availability. Most companies were already overwhelmed with calls from customers facing similar problems. 20 minutes later, David's footsteps thundered up the basement stairs, and I heard him deliver the news to his family. "Earliest anyone can come out is Monday morning. Everyone's booked solid." Jennifer's response was immediate and sharp. "Monday? David, we can't live without heat until Monday. The forecast says it's going to stay below freezing all weekend." "I know that," David snapped, his patience clearly fraying. "I'm doing the best I can here." This was the first crack in their usual family dynamics. David, who prided himself on being the capable provider and problem solver, was being forced to admit powerlessness. Jennifer, accustomed to having her comfort prioritized, was discovering that some problems couldn't be solved through scheduling and organization. By 11 o'clock, the house temperature had dropped to 62 degrees, and the family was learning what I had known for months, that multiple layers of clothing were necessary for basic comfort. I could hear them moving around, opening and closing closet doors, arguing over who had claimed which blankets. Tyler appeared at my bedroom door around 11:15, his face flushed with cold and anger. "Grandma, do you have any extra space heaters?" It was the first time in weeks that he had spoken to me directly, and certainly the first time he had called me Grandma instead of just ignoring my presence. Desperation, I reflected, had a way of restoring basic courtesy. "I have a small one," I replied, gesturing toward the unit I had strategically positioned in my room. "But it's only powerful enough for this space." Tyler's eyes widened slightly as he realized that my room was noticeably warmer than the rest of the house. "How is it so warm in here?" "Preparation," I said simply. "I've been cold in this house for months, so I learned to adapt. The comment hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that Tyler was just beginning to understand. For the first time, he seemed to see me as something other than background furniture. I was someone who had successfully solved a problem he was currently facing. Could I maybe sleep in here tonight? He asked, his teenage pride warring with his physical discomfort. I'm afraid my bed isn't large enough for 2 people, I replied, not unkindly but without offering alternatives. Perhaps you could ask your parents for suggestions. Tyler left without another word, but I could see in his face the dawning realization that I was somehow weathering this crisis better than the rest of the family. The student was beginning to understand that the teacher had been holding back valuable knowledge. Around midnight, I heard David attempting to implement emergency heating measures. He had driven to his hardware store to retrieve space heaters, only to discover that his limited inventory was insufficient for heating a house the size of theirs. The units he brought home were small, inefficient, and capable of warming single rooms at best. Jennifer's voice rose in frustration as she tried to coordinate the placement of these inadequate devices. This one isn't doing anything in the living room, and the bedrooms are like ice boxes. It's the best I can do until Monday, David replied, his own voice strained with exhaustion and cold. We'll just have to make it work. Make it work? Jennifer's tone was incredulous. David, it's 58 degrees in Emma's room. That's not making it work, that's surviving. The word surviving struck me as particularly appropriate. They were experiencing exactly what I had been doing for months. Surviving in an environment where their basic comfort was secondary to someone else's priorities. The only difference was that their discomfort was temporary and unintentional, while mine had been prolonged and deliberate. By 1 a.m, the family had gathered in the living room, wrapped in every blanket they could find and huddled around the fireplace that David had been feeding continuously for hours. The scene would have been cozy under different circumstances, but their faces showed stress and discomfort rather than warmth and togetherness. Emma was curled up in a chair, wearing what appeared to be every piece of warm clothing she owned. Tyler lay on the floor near the hearth, trying to absorb heat directly from the flames. Jennifer sat rigidly upright, her jaw clenched with the kind of controlled anger that comes from being powerless to solve an immediate problem. I emerged from my room around 1:30, wrapped in my robe but clearly more comfortable than any of them. The contrast was obvious and intentional. Can't sleep? Jennifer asked, her voice carrying a bitter edge. Too cold? Actually, my room is quite comfortable, I replied truthfully. I was just checking to see if anyone needed anything. The offer was genuine, but also strategic. I wanted them to see that I had resources they lacked, solutions they hadn't considered, comfort they couldn't access. I was demonstrating the same kind of casual superiority they had shown me for months. David looked up from where he was adding another log to the fire. How is your room comfortable? The whole house is freezing. Small space heater, proper insulation around the windows, thermal blankets, I explained matter-of-factly. When you've been cold for as long as I have, you learn to prepare for it. The implication was clear. While they had been enjoying their comfortable, climate-controlled environment, I had been developing survival skills. While they had been taking heat for granted, I had been learning to create warmth through ingenuity and preparation. Jennifer's eyes narrowed slightly. You've been cold for as long as you have? Margaret, we keep this house at a perfectly reasonable temperature. 65 degrees, I agreed. Which is exactly what the thermostat is reading now. The difference is that now you're experiencing it without the ability to change it. The silence that followed was loaded with recognition. For the first time, they were connecting their current discomfort with the conditions they had been imposing on me. They were learning what it felt like to be cold and powerless simultaneously. Tyler was the first to voice what they were all thinking. So you're saying you've been this cold every day? Every day for months, I confirmed. The difference is that I learned to adapt instead of complaining. David's face flushed with something that might have been embarrassment or anger. You never said you were really uncomfortable. I did say it, I replied quietly, multiple times. But my comfort was apparently less important than keeping utility bills low. The truth hung in the room like smoke from the fireplace, impossible to ignore or dismiss. They were finally understanding the connection between their current crisis and their past decisions, between their immediate discomfort and my prolonged endurance. But understanding and accepting responsibility were different things. As the night wore on and their discomfort increased, I could see resistance beginning to build alongside their awareness. They were starting to suspect that their heating failure wasn't entirely coincidental, and with that suspicion came the beginning of anger rather than remorse. The real test of their character would come with the dawn, when they would have to choose between acknowledging their treatment of me or finding someone else to blame for their suffering. Sunday morning brought the bitter fulfillment of the weather service's dire predictions. Outside, the thermometer registered -3 degrees, with wind chills approaching -20. Inside, the house had settled into a bone-deep cold that no amount of blankets or space heaters could fully combat. The heating system had failed completely around 4 in the morning, leaving the family to face the coldest day of the winter without their most basic comfort. I woke refreshed in my warm cocoon, having slept soundly while the rest of the house endured a miserable night of fitful dozing and constant shivering. Through my bedroom door, I could hear the sounds of a family in crisis. Muffled conversations, running water as someone tried to warm their hands, and the constant shuffling of feet as people moved to generate body heat. When I emerged from my room at 8 o'clock, I found them gathered in the kitchen, wearing multiple layers and looking like refugees from their own home. Jennifer stood at the stove, attempting to heat water for coffee while wearing gloves, her breath visible in small puffs. David sat at the table with his laptop, frantically calling repair services and discovering what I already knew. No one was available until Monday at the earliest. Emma and Tyler huddled near the space heater that provided a pathetic circle of warmth in the otherwise frigid room. Both teenagers looked thoroughly miserable, their usual confident demeanor replaced by the sullen endurance of people learning that comfort wasn't guaranteed. "Good morning," I said pleasantly, pouring myself a cup of the hot coffee Jennifer had prepared. The steam rising from my mug seemed almost mocking in the cold air. Jennifer looked up from the stove, her face drawn with exhaustion and something approaching desperation. "Margaret, this is a disaster. We can't live like this." "It certainly is uncomfortable," I agreed, settling into my usual spot at the kitchen counter. Though I have to say it's remarkable how quickly one adapts to difficult conditions when there's no alternative. David's head snapped up from his laptop. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Simply that adversity teaches resilience," I replied, stirring honey into my coffee with deliberate calm. "I've learned quite a bit about managing discomfort over the past few months." The silence that followed was charged with unspoken accusations and growing suspicion. Tyler was the first to voice what they were all thinking. "Grandma, do you know anything about the furnace breaking?" I met his gaze steadily. "I know that heating systems sometimes fail, especially older units under stress from severe weather. It's unfortunate timing, but these things happen." Jennifer stepped closer, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Margaret, this is a serious situation. If you know something about what's wrong with our heat, you need to tell us." "I know many things about heating systems," I replied truthfully. "Your grandfather taught me quite a bit about home maintenance over the years. But knowing how something works doesn't mean I'm responsible when it stops working." David's face was flushing red, whether from cold or anger I couldn't tell. "This is too convenient to be coincidence. The system was working fine until yesterday." "Mechanical failures often seem sudden," I explained, maintaining my teacher's voice of patient instruction. "But they're usually the result of gradual problems that accumulate over time. Like relationships, really. Small neglects and careless treatments can create vulnerabilities that eventually lead to complete breakdown. The metaphor wasn't lost on any of them." Jennifer's eyes narrowed as she realized I was talking about more than just furnaces. "So you're saying this is our fault somehow?" "I'm saying that when you treat something, or someone, as if their proper function doesn't matter, you shouldn't be surprised when that function becomes compromised." Emma, who had been quiet until now, suddenly spoke up. "Are you talking about how we treat you?" The question hung in the frigid air like a challenge. Here was my opportunity to deliver the lesson I had been building toward, to connect their current suffering with their past behavior in a way that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. "I'm talking about consequences," I said, setting down my coffee cup and looking at each of them in turn. For months, I've lived in temperatures you now find unbearable. I've eaten cold meals while you enjoyed hot ones. I've been excluded from family decisions, treated like hired help in a house I pay to live in, and made to feel invisible in my own family. Jennifer started to protest, but I held up my hand. I've asked for warmer temperatures and been told to wear more layers. I've requested inclusion in meal planning and been handed lists of chores instead. I've tried to participate in family conversations and been dismissed as irrelevant background noise. David's voice was defensive. We never meant to make you feel that way. Intent matters less than impact, I replied, borrowing a phrase from my teaching days. The impact was that I learned to feel cold, excluded, and unwelcome in my own family. Now you're experiencing what that feels like. Tyler, despite his discomfort, seemed to grasp the situation more clearly than the adults. So you did break the furnace. I helped you learn a lesson, I corrected. Sometimes the most powerful education comes through experience rather than explanation. The confession, or perhaps it was better called a revelation, transformed the atmosphere in the room. The family's faces moved through a spectrum of emotions: surprise, anger, grudging understanding, and something that might have been respect. Jennifer was the first to recover her voice. Margaret, this is vindictive. You're putting us all at risk to make a point. No more at risk than I've been for months, I replied calmly. The difference is that your discomfort has an endpoint. Mine didn't, until I created one. David stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. So what now? Do we all freeze until you've made your point? That depends, I said, finishing my coffee and rising from my seat. Are you ready to discuss some changes in how this household operates? The negotiation that followed was unlike any family conversation we had ever had. Sitting around the kitchen table in our winter coats, we addressed issues that had been festering beneath the surface of our shared living arrangement for months. I presented my conditions with the same methodical approach I brought to my sabotage: specific, measurable changes that would restore my dignity and comfort. The thermostat would be set to a temperature we all agreed upon. Meal planning would include my preferences and dietary needs. Household decisions that affected me would include my input. Most importantly, I would be treated as a family member rather than a convenient caretaker. Jennifer initially resisted, calling my demands unreasonable and manipulative. But as the hours passed and the cold deepened, pragmatism began to override pride. David, shivering despite multiple layers, finally asked the question I had been waiting for. If we agree to these changes, can you fix the heat? I can address the mechanical issues that are causing the system to malfunction, I replied carefully, though it might take some time to fully resolve the problems. The relief on their faces was palpable, but it was Tyler who asked the more important question. And if we go back to treating you badly after the heat's fixed? I smiled at my grandson's perceptiveness. Then you'll discover that I've learned quite a lot about home maintenance over the years. Plumbing, electrical systems, water heaters. They all require proper care and attention to function reliably. The implicit threat was clear: respect would be ongoing, or so would the mechanical difficulties. They were learning that underestimating elderly family members could be a costly mistake. By late afternoon, we had reached an agreement. The family would treat me with the dignity and consideration that any paying household member deserved. In return, I would restore their heating system and share my considerable knowledge of home maintenance for everyone's benefit. I spent an hour in the basement, reversing my careful sabotage and explaining to David the real maintenance requirements his system needed. As the furnace roared back to life and warm air began flowing through the house, I saw genuine gratitude in my family's faces for the first time in months. But more importantly, I saw respect. They had learned that Margaret Sullivan wasn't just a convenient grandmother to be managed and marginalized. I was a force to be reckoned with, someone whose comfort and dignity mattered as much as their own. That evening, we shared a hot meal together at the dining room table, all of us at the same time, with equal portions and equal say in the conversation. The soup was homemade, served steaming hot, and accompanied by the kind of warmth that had nothing to do with the thermostat setting. As I looked around the table at my family, chastened but wiser, uncomfortable but learning, I realized that sometimes the most important lessons are taught not through words, but through the simple act of refusing to accept what's unacceptable. They had learned what it meant to be cold and powerless. Now they were learning what it meant to share warmth and respect. It was, I reflected, a much better education than any of us had expected when that first cold front moved through our lives. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.